I'm feeling really nervous. There's loads of people here. I wasn't really expecting this many people. Something that happens when I'm nervous is that I sometimes get very kind of tangled in the head, or my mind goes blank. So I was wondering if, what I'd quite like to do is, I really want to try and speak from like the kind of alive embodied experience of what I'm talking about. So I was wondering if something that helps me is humming and singing a little bit. So I was wondering if you might be up for joining me in a hum, and I'll sing a little song. Great. So just a gentle hum. So let's go. Keep going with the hum. Pure and empty are all events. Pure and empty am I. All is pure and empty as infinite blue sky. Pure and empty are all events. Pure and empty am I. All is pure and empty as infinite blue sky. Pure and empty are all events. Pure and empty am I. All is pure and empty as infinite blue sky. Thank you for that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about enchantment. I've always had, I guess I've always had like a kind of fascination or a love for enchantment, the experience of enchantment, the notion of enchantment. And I think I can probably trace that back to a childhood obsessed with Disney films. I used to just watch so many Disney films when I was a child. And 25 or so years later, I was writing my master's dissertation on this experience of enchantment. I won't go into too many details of like the specifics of what it was that I was researching and writing about and thinking about. But if anyone wants to talk to me about this at any point, I love chatting about this stuff. So come and find me and we can have a chat about it. So often when we think of enchantment, we might think about enchanted forests and fairy tales and this kind of thing. But the kind of enchantment that I want to talk about is something which is a little bit more like subtle or nuanced or something than this. The kind of enchantment that I want to talk about is, and I want to just mention a writer that I really love called Jane Bennet, who talks a lot about this kind of experience of enchantment, and some of the things that I'm going to be saying, and I'm going to be quoting a little bit from her. And she talks about this experience of enchantment as being, she talks about it as like a moment suspended when we are like transfixed by wonder and transported by sense. So the word enchantment comes from the French enchanter, to sing or to chant. And as a singer, when I found this out, I got so excited. So to be enchanted is to be spellbound. So it's as if a spell has been cast upon you, or you're under the influence of an incantation. So to be enchanted is to be kind of temporarily immobilized. So our mind doesn't move to anything else by association. We have this moment when we are entirely immersed in most likely a sensory experience. So, and maybe our limbs might be temporarily immobilized as well. So we are kind of just, it's a moment suspended where time seems to stop. as if we're under a spell. And I imagine that most people here will have had an experience of this at some point. Something like, an experience that comes to me is like being on a walk on a spring summer evening and maybe around like a suburban street, and then just suddenly being hit by this smell of jasmine. And this smell, it kind of hits me and fills my whole sensory experience, such that there are no kind of mental processes involved. I'm not really kind of thinking anything. I'm just completely absorbed in this sensory experience. And maybe like no words come, but I might go like, it might be a kind of, wow, or something like this. So it's a moment when we are completely absorbed in this sensory experience. Or we might be walking along a city street and we'll see a little white feather just like floating. And in that moment, like that sensory experience just fills everything in us. And sometimes this can function as a synecdoche, where that single experience then it points towards something much bigger than itself. And maybe like this little experience will point us towards like the wonder of everything that exists. Like, how can anything so magnificent exist? So I want to talk a little bit about some qualities of this experience of enchantment. And then I want to say a little bit about stories and narratives. And then I'm going to say a little bit about why I believe enchantment matters, why it's not just a frivolous thing, why it's something that I feel is really important. So the first quality of enchantment that I want to talk about is this idea of it being relational and conditioned. So I'm not talking about like a kind of a form of enchantment or enchantedness that exists objectively in the world. We could talk about kind of like animism or panpsychism or but that would be a much kind of longer talk. So I'm just going to talk about this experience of enchantment that exists between the perceiving consciousness, body, heart, mind, and the object in the world. And so it's not something that exists either in the subject or the object, but it's kind of produced in the spaces in between. And in that way, it's relational and it's conditioned. And the second quality that I want to talk about is that it's embodied and it's effective. So it's this sense of, we know that we're enchanted because we feel it in our bodies. And that might be a sense of, it's something around like allowing the world inside. It's like allowing ourselves to be porous to the world. It's allowing ourselves to be like receptive and sensitive, and a kind of increased sensitivity to like the possibilities of allowing the world inside. So it's allowing ourselves to be moved by the world. And in that way, it kind of breaks down this boundary between the perceived object and the subject. It kind of breaks down this separation between the self and the world, because the world is coming inside and it's affecting us on the inside. And I think particularly when we're thinking about these like sensory experiences of kind of smell and taste and touch, are like way more than the kind of visual and the hearing, which have kind of, tend to be prioritized in like often in kind of, definitely in kind of Western academic perceptions of the world. When we bring in our smells and our tastes and our touch, that's like those senses are allowing the world inside. It's bringing what's outside in. It's allowing ourselves to be moved and affected and touched. And the next quality that I want to talk about is this idea of enchantment as not being dependent on any idea of a designed or purposive universe. It can be, of course, and it doesn't preclude that kind of understanding of the world. But what I want to suggest is that in order to be enchanted by the world, we don't need to believe that it's that it's designed, or that it's, or in anything particularly supernatural, though we might believe in that. This kind of enchantment that I'm talking about, we can allow ourselves to be enchanted by all manner of mundane things, like this feather floating across the road. It doesn't have to be anything particularly out of the ordinary. It's more around allowing ourselves to be kind of struck by the extraordinary that lives among or amid or within the very normal and the very mundane. And the final quality of enchantment that I want to talk about is this notion that it's a choice, that we can choose to be enchanted by the world. And there are loads of ways that we can go about increasing our sensitivity to this experience of enchantment. One of them might be, or one of them is, I think, paying attention, like practices that foreground. We'll find a lot of them in this space in Buddhafield Festival. Mindfulness practices that just that connect us with this sense of like the magic that exists all around us all the time, and really like that it can be very normal. It can be a very, very normal thing. But just by paying attention to it, we increase our aliveness to that experience of being enchanted by the very ordinary. And another way that we can sort of choose to allow ourselves to be enchanted by the world. This comes into the next thing that I want to talk about, which is stories. So the stories, of course, the stories that we tell ourselves about the world form the world that we live in, and form our experience of the world that we live in. And there's this narrative, which is that the modern world is disenchanted, and this is it has been quite a popular narrative, and there are loads of reasons why we can talk about why it's not the case. But a sociologist called Max Weber talked about this idea that enchantment belongs to a time when mysterious forces seem to operate beyond the bounds of human understanding. Like long ago, the world was enchanted when we didn't understand it. And then with industrialization, the world became calculable and understandable, and we were able to kind of, there were no mysteries anymore, only kind of temporal mysteries, such that at some point we will be able to understand it with our minds, with our intellect, with our rationality. And like I said, there are so many, we could talk about this for a long time, why this narrative is not, why we might disagree with this narrative. But I kind of want to talk more about, why it's just the particular story that we tell ourselves about the world that affects the way that we interact with that world. So if we believe that, or if we tell ourselves the story that we live in a disenchanted world, then that's the world that we'll live in, and we just won't notice the possible sites of enchantment that are all around us. And if, on the other hand, we tell ourselves the story that we live in a magical, enchanted world, and that's the world that we'll live in, and we'll notice the possible sites of enchantment that are all around us all of the time. And I want to suggest, just finally, that this really matters. I think this really, really matters. I don't think this is just a kind of frivolous thing. And I think this because, I guess for me, I feel that being enchanted by the world is maybe one way towards falling in love with the world. And if we fall in love with the world, if we're in love with the world, then how can we do harm to it? I want to finish off with a quotation from someone who I interviewed during the research that I was doing a little while ago. This is our dear friend Gemma, who I interviewed as part of my field work. And I think this really kind of sums up this sense of, why being enchanted by the world might matter. If it gives someone just a glimmer, just enough to see the magic in the universe, the enchantment of it, I really do think that's a big part in people not effing up the planet. If you see it like that, you just can't do things that are harming. You just can't. And I think that's the antidote to how we as a collective treat the planet and the harm that we do. Can you imagine if we all saw this magic, experienced this wonder and awe? You just couldn't do anything to hurt it. Yeah, thank you.